Hello everyone, Shalom. Today we're going to have a conversation with Mr. WS. Mr. WS is someone who has left Islam. Alright, let's get straight to the introduction. Shalom. Hello Mr. WS.
Good evening.
Alright, perhaps we can start with an introduction. Could you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, I teach at one of the fairly well-known state universities in Indonesia, in a faculty that leans more towards the scientific disciplines. Interestingly, in these scientific faculties, I often find that the approach to religion among peers tends to be more dogmatic compared to those in the humanities faculties. I live in a city in East Java, and that's a little about me for now.
Okay. May I ask, were you born Muslim?
Yes, I was born into a Muslim environment. However, it wasn't a particularly strict Muslim environment. It was more about fulfilling basic religious obligations, like prayer. For example, my father couldn't properly recite the Quran. He could only read a little. As for me, from a young age kindergarten and elementary school, I was already in a relatively pluralistic environment. Naturally, because of that environment, I followed the majority's practices. So, I observed the religious duties of my previous faith. Even so, from the beginning, my mother raised me to be open-minded. My journey of change wasn't drastic, it was evolutionary. The more I read and learned, the more it affirmed the doubts I had already been feeling. The more information and enlightenment I received about my previous faith, the stronger my conviction grew that I could no longer accept it.
Regarding your previous faith, where did you learn about it, and how deeply did you understand it?
Mostly from school. My parents never pushed me to join religious study groups or the like, but through school, I was able to gain a solid foundation. I could read the Holy Book fluently in its original language.
Would you mind reciting a short chapter for us?
Sure.
A'udzu birabbin nas, malikin nas, ilahin nas, min syarril waswasil khannas, alladzi yuwaswisu fi sudurin nas, minal jinnati wan nas.
Which chapter would you like?
Wattin wa zaitunin wa turi sinin wa hadal baladil amin. Laqad khalaqnal insana fi ahsanit taqwim. Thumma radadna asfala safilin illa ladina amanu wa amilus solihati. Walahum ajrun ghairu mamnun. Wa ma yukadzibuka ba'du biddin. Alaysallahu bi ahkamil hakimin.
I can read fluently. Earlier, I read quickly, so I hope everyone understands it was just a demonstration.
Alright. Please don't judge the tone or speed too harshly. It was just to show that Mr. WS indeed used to be Muslim and could read the Quran. Now, did you understand the meaning?
Well, I didn't reach the level of deep understanding like a santry. However, I've studied linguistics, so I could grasp the meaning of certain words and phrases. In school, some short chapters were explained in the curriculum, like the meanings of certain surahs for specific grades. So I could understand the basic meanings of short chapters, though I didn't delve deeply.
So your Islamic education was limited to what is taught in public schools?
Yes, the religious education in public schools. I didn't participate in specific Quran study forums or groups, but while I still believed in Islam, I followed it and chose to listen to more tolerant religious scholars or preachers. For example, I found enlightenment from Buya Syakar's teachings, which greatly influenced me.
Could you name other preachers you learned from?
From the beginning, I decided not to listen to preachers like Ustaz Adi or Ustaz Abdul Somad. I heard them occasionally on social media, but their approach didn't resonate with me. Instead, I explored alternative perspectives, including writings in forums like the Jaringan Islam Liberal Islam Network, which was active around 2021. From there, I began to question dogmatic concepts in my former faith. However, I still held on to fears and sought alternative interpretations of the teaching zones that weren't rigid or dogmatic. Eventually, I realized that trying to adhere to the religion while seeking alternative paths didn't make sense. It was clear that I didn't truly believe in it anymore, leading me to where I am today. I've had these doubts for a long time, even since high school. I graduated in 2000, so I am relatively old. I began reading extensively during my undergraduate years. My background is in engineering, where religious preaching, especially by groups like HTI, was very prominent at the time. Their methods were quite forceful, and I resisted them internally, though not outwardly confrontational. As I delved deeper, I realized I was essentially seeking justification for something inherently problematic. For instance, certain contradictory teachings and behaviors attributed to the Prophet troubled me. Initially, I tried to rationalize them, like the issue of Aisha's age be attributing them to cultural differences of the time. But this contradicted the claim that the religion is universal and timeless. The more I reflected, the clearer it became that these inconsistencies pointed to fundamental issues. On top of that, I encountered contradictions in historical narratives, a lack of scientific evidence, and chronological discrepancies. These realizations led me to accept that what I had believed in was deeply flawed.
Let me clarify. Some people might say you left Islam because you didn't fully understand it. But you mentioned earlier that you studied Islam in school, listened to preachers like Ustaz Adi Hidayat, Ustaz Abdul Somad, and others, and even followed more pluralistic figures like Buya Siakur. Is it correct to say that you engaged with their teachings but didn't agree with them?
Yes, that's correct. It's not that I completely ignored or didn't follow those figures. I listened to them and paid attention to what they said, but there were things that didn't sit right with me, things I found strange or unacceptable. So it's not about a lack of understanding. It's about not being able to reconcile what I heard and learned with my own reasoning and reflections.
So you mentioned that your doubts started in high school, even before figures like Ustaz Adi Hidayat became prominent? What first made you feel something was wrong back then?
It was primarily the way religion was taught by our religious teachers and the activities of Islamic religious groups, like Rohis, Islamic Spirituality Group. I went to a public school, and the religious education was very homogeneous. Even though the language they used was as polite as possible, the message was clear. People of other faiths were labeled as kafir or idolaters. Christians were said to worship 3 gods. Hindus and Buddhists were accused of worshiping statues, and so on. At that time, I already couldn't accept this narrative because I came from a very heterogeneous family. My mother, who is a Christian, was someone I deeply admired for her sincerity in prayer and her kind nature. I knew firsthand that she didn't worship 3 gods. I even started to make cheeky comments like, "You say others worship statues or idols, but what about facing the Kaaba when you pray? Isn't that similar?" Their defense was always about focusing their prayers, but I'd argue that other religions say the same. These small seeds of doubt grew, especially because I couldn't accept how my teachers and religious leaders spoke about other beliefs.
And this continued into your college years?
Yes. By the time I entered college in 2000, the 11th of September attacks happened in 2001. That event and its aftermath had a profound impact on shaping my thoughts. The way people around me reacted, and the discussions that arose further solidified my doubts.
So, by the time you reached college and the internet was becoming more accessible, how did that influence your journey?
Yes, the internet started to play a significant role during that time. I remember joining some mailing lists, like Fight for Freedom, FFF. Although I wasn't active there, I observed the discussions. The group leaned heavily on atheism, but I didn't agree with atheism as a concept. However, the ideas they shared often challenged me. For example, they made jokes about constantly praying, "Guide us on the straight path" from Surah Al-Fatiha, as if the straight path being revealed was actually the one I was questioning. Those ideas stuck with me. But even then, I wasn't ready to fully accept them. The indoctrination from childhood, the fear of hell, divine punishment, and so on was deeply ingrained in my subconscious.
So, the process of letting go wasn't immediate?
Exactly. It was a long process filled with denial. For instance, when FFF discussed controversial hadiths or actions attributed to the Prophet like the marriage to Aisha, or accounts of raids and massacres, I dismissed them, thinking those must be da'if, weak, or maudu fabricated hadiths. But as I studied more independently, I realized these accounts were often from sources considered sahih, authentic, in Islamic tradition. That revelation shook me. Even then, I couldn't break away entirely because of the fear planted by religious teachings throughout my upbringing. It wasn't until much later that I was able to process these doubts and come to terms with them.
So the crucial point is that you feel that what was taught before seems to be made into a metaphor or even manipulated to appear more aligned with today's morality?
Yes, that's correct. When I was studying in school, things like slavery, robbery, or the Prophet's marriage to Aisha were not explained plainly. For example, slavery was often reinterpreted as a form of modern employment, like an employee or a housekeeper. But in the original context, it was truly slavery, where humans were treated as property that could be bought and sold.
So, after delving into it yourself, you feel that these explanations actually hide the truth?
Exactly. These explanations seem to obscure the true meaning, which is actually much more problematic. For instance, when talking about the Prophet's marriage to Aisha, it is always framed with the excuse of culture or historical context. But if religion is claimed to be universal and relevant across time, then these rules should still be relevant today without needing such excuses.
So, this is what eventually made you more doubtful about the truth of the doctrine?
Yes. When a doctrine that is said to be perfect actually contradicts today's values of humanity and justice, I began to realize there was a fundamental issue. Things that were previously taught as full of wisdom, after I explored them further, turned out to be evidence of the weaknesses of the religion's claims to truth. And it's not just about slavery. There are so many things.
Back in school, what were you taught about the Prophet? For instance, you weren't told about constant wars or marrying underage girls. Were you?
I was, but in a different context or point of view. For example, wars were described as acts of defense, saying, "Oh, the war was fought to protect the community," or "they were attacked first, so they had to defend themselves." Jihad was framed as defending property or territory from being taken over by others. The Prophet's tolerance was emphasized through things like the Medina Charter. However, when I later researched the Medina Charter and its contents, I found that what I learned in school was the opposite of the truth. For instance, the raid on Khaybar was presented as an act of self-defense, but even their own historical sources state it was an initiative. If it's an initiative, that means it was an offensive act, not defense attacking first for political or economic reasons. They dressed it up as self-defense, but after I read further, I realized, how is this self-defense? The context clearly shows it was about annexation and conquest. Everything my religion teachers taught me in school crumbled after that. So, what I once denied, because of the way my teachers metaphorically sugar-coated everything, eventually collapsed entirely.
Okay, so after graduating and studying on your own, you realized the truth was very different.
Yes, you could say that. The reality didn't match what I was taught. It was sugar-coated, prettied up, and covered with layers of makeup to make it look pure and perfect from the outside, but the inside wasn't like that.
Would you say you were lied to? Why do you think it needed to be sugar-coated like that?
Yes, because it's about preserving this existence. The need to preserve existence. Why? Because after studying politics and other things, I realized that it's indeed important. In their point of view, especially when they hold power, it's crucial to maintain that. That is, maintaining faith in something dogmatic is important because it helps ensure a large quantity. That's why one of the things often said, especially when I was still in college, was, get married early, increase your offspring. It was said quite often, and later I realized that this was an effort to preserve existence. It's important for those at the top to maintain their power and continuity. Moreover, after the era of openness, when information became available and could no longer be hidden, things that were once concealed became open and validated. We once didn't know the details and were only told to read, but when I paid attention to religious study circles, I realized that it was all about just reading and studying. There were many things that were not conveyed. Then, when I watched discussion videos, like those by Christian Prince, for example, or others from outside Indonesia with valid evidence, I saw links and could verify them. This made me realize that there were things being covered up or not fully shared, if not lies, then simply things that weren't told as they truly were. Another thing I felt was the authenticity of the scripture, especially with all its versions. I used to strongly believe that there were only 7 Qira'at, 7 dialects. But then evidence emerged showing that it wasn't just dialects or Qira'at. I eventually read the original text and saw that it was different.
Okay, I just want to clarify for the audience so it's clearer. What Mr. WS meant earlier is that, for example, an imam or a religious teacher makes a living from their congregation, and if they tell them the truth about Muhammad's actions from childhood, people would leave. So, if everything is laid out plainly, there would be no followers and everything would collapse. That's why it needs to be sugar-coated, made to look beautiful. Now, I want to ask this. There must have been some fear. I mean, especially since you were taught from a young age that leaving Islam means going to hell. apostasy leads to hell, and non-believers are evil and so on. You were taught to be afraid of all that since you were a child. How did you manage to overcome this fear?
Yes, it was very difficult. I mean, it's very challenging. Even to this day, for example, I still fast, even though I've already decided to do intermittent fasting. But still, when I think about it, it took me a long time to get to this point. When everything collapsed, it was like I had to work hard to break free from that fear. At the end, when I finally made the decision to lock out, I realized that there were many beliefs I had been trying to maintain for a long time. Despite my denials, the facts eventually overwhelmed me. So, I reached a conclusion. Of the 10 things I had been taught as the truth, most of them had crumbled. So, what is there left to hold on to? The one thing left seemed to claim it was the path chosen by God. That's why my religion teacher once said, "This is the only religion with official endorsement, like it has an official decree that says this is the religion for you," according to one of the verses. Eventually, that belief also collapsed. Why? Because then we reasoned, who is the one delivering that message? Oh, it's in the scripture. Who gave the scripture? They say it's the word of God. But who can prove that the word of God is true? Once one thing was proven not to be, everything else seemed to fall apart too. At that point, I was able to overcome my fear using logic.
Now, regarding the most difficult part, which is about heaven and hell, how do you reason about that? It's something that cannot be proven. Then, the question arises, what about when you die? What happens then?
Actually, T here is one more thing that used to be just a casual question, but eventually, it became something very serious that changed my belief. For example, when it's said that certain people, including prophets, saw heaven and hell, seeing people like this in heaven and people like that in hell, I thought, wait, they say heaven and hell are after the apocalypse. So how can they see heaven and hell now? What exactly did they see? Was there a time machine involved? Is there a contradiction in the timeline? The concept of time itself seemed very contradictory. Then, I realized that the concept of heaven and hell that had been marketed by my previous religion was something that wasn't as literal as it seemed, especially when it was said that in heaven there would be rivers flowing beneath, with fruits, etc. But on the other hand, some people said heaven was a place for sexual pleasures where the activity was just to break virgins every day and so on. I thought, what is this heaven? It's like, when one thing crumbles, the rest crumbles too. If heaven itself can't be understood logically or sensibly, then hell must be the same. As I may have mentioned before the live, when I finally locked out, I wasn't choosing a religion that might be followed by Mr. Tamparagi, with all due respect. But I came to the conclusion that heaven and hell are definitely not what I believed they were before.
Okay, but I still don't quite understand Mr. WS. The thing is, regarding heaven, fine, maybe it's illogical and unappealing, but hell is still tied to the emotional fear. It's still there, right? Even if we're not interested in heaven, we'd still think, well, the most important thing is that I don't end up in hell.
Yes, well, getting out of that fear was also a very difficult thing. As far as I know, it was very, very difficult. But as I said, in the end, what strengthened me was my reasoning. Once the concept of heaven collapsed, everything related to it also collapsed. So, when the concept of heaven crumbled, the concept of hell that was presented also, in my reasoning, collapsed as well. So for now, I am still at that stage. I mean, I haven't reached the stage where I can say, well, what will it look like later? I haven't gotten there yet. But the point is, for now, I feel much more comfortable. It means that I feel more comfortable when I want to do something that is considered good. My guide now is that what I do is good for the benefit of humanity, for the good of others, for the good of all of us, for the good of nature, for the good of our environment. I do these things without the fear that one day I will receive a reward in the form of something called heaven. Similarly, hell. When I choose not to do bad things, I avoid harming myself, others, and the environment, and those bad things are in fact what I now believe to be hell. When I get angry at someone, when I do evil things, bad consequences follow. For example, when I steal, when I speak harshly, or when I commit wrongdoings. Here is a Javanese saying, molimo, meaning breaking all the rules. It means the consequences will always be bad, and that's my version of hell. Until now, I have reached that point, and I've managed to break free from the belief that certain acts of worship, like prayer or fasting during Ramadan, are tied to receiving rewards. Those are things I have let go of. How did I manage to let go? That's what I was explaining earlier, from what I've experienced.
Okay, thank you, sir. So, to clarify for everyone, this is a testimony of Mr. WS leaving Islam. And what we're talking about now is not about Mr. WS becoming a Christian, because Mr. WS is also not a Christian. So Mr. WS' position is logged out. Okay, I won't ask where Mr. WS will go later because this is a journey. It's a life journey. But what's important is that the current position is logged out first. That's the key. Because earlier, the issue of heaven and hell is the hardest part, the fear. We fear something that we don't understand, and it has been deeply ingrained in us. So if children nowadays are being taught that, especially with the appearance of movies about hell's torture, it keeps getting instilled, and the fear continues from a young age. What makes Mr. WS not afraid anymore is, as he said, reason because heaven doesn't make sense. Heaven is not right. It can't possibly be like that. That means hell can't be like that either. So the reasoning is like that. So Mr. WS' position now is no longer one of fear. Like, if I don't pray, I'll go to hell for tens of thousands of years. Or, if I don't wipe properly, I'll go to hell. Or, if I don't squat to urinate, I'll go to hell. Those fears are no longer there.
Yes, exactly. Sorry if I am being too blunt, but this is really how I feel. I apologize to those who are still in that belief. That's how it is. In the end, it became something I once denied, and now I laugh at myself when I remember how I used to deny it. It's like, what was I denying? What was the point of it?
It's like how, when we were children, we believed in fairy tales. We trusted those stories, but at some point, we thought, why did I get so obsessed with these fairy tales? It's like believing in Superman or Batman, for example. Is a similar feeling, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so may I know what was the button? What was the button that made you finally decide to say, I am logging out, I can't go back anymore? What was that button for you?
It's complex, so I can't pinpoint the exact moment. What's clear is that I started deciding to leave behind what was considered obligatory, like the pillars in this religion. It's been almost a year now, not long at all. It's hard to pinpoint the turning point because the process wasn't revolutionary. It was very evolutionary. So, I left things behind gradually, step by step. It wasn't like suddenly I stopped praying or fasting. It didn't happen that way. The process wasn't sudden, it was slow. Initially, I still had the mindset, like my daughter, for example, who sometimes wanted to wear a hijab. But now, I've already made that decision, and I've started to let go of that with my child as well, little by little. I am not saying this was a turning point or a button to press, but it's like something that gradually loosened up first one thing, then another, until everything was let go. The last thing to go was when I decided that with everything I've experienced, I can say that conceptually, I've already left a long time ago. Not just this year, but since I decided not to follow those obligations anymore. It's hard to answer, as it wasn't one clear moment or button.
Let me rephrase the question, sir. This has been a long process starting from high school, when you already felt like things weren't right with the accusations and so on. One by one, the pillars fell down. What I'm asking is, what was the last pillar to fall, sir?
The last pillar was fasting, because I am in an environment that's scientific in nature. I read a lot of journals, a lot of scientific works, and what's been claimed about fasting and all its rules and dramas just doesn't align with what I was taught. So, when it's said that we shouldn't drink or eat for 13 hours, especially in the case of Indonesia, it turns out that it's actually unhealthy. This contradicts what we were always told, that it was a command from God to make us healthier or detox our bodies. But scientifically, that's not true. So, when we feel thirsty, when we feel dryness in our throats, the first thing we should do is drink. Why? Because it's related to our metabolism. That means the way we were taught was wrong. The second issue is about the timing of fasting. When we believe that fasting is obligatory, and we are in a scientific environment, we know that not every region has the same fasting time as indicated in the teachings. It is said that fasting begins at sunrise and ends at sunset. But what happens in the northern hemisphere during the solstice? What happens in the southern hemisphere during its solstice? At those times, there is no sunrise or sunset. In certain places, the sun may only appear for 2 hours, or it may appear for up to 20 hours. This has led to many different interpretations and opinions. Some suggest that it can be tolerated by following the time in the equator region, for example, or in Saudi Arabia. So, it's clear that this doesn't apply universally. That's the second issue. The first issue, from the health perspective, has already fallen apart, and the second, from the universal applicability perspective, has also fallen apart. The next issue, which might seem a bit absurd, is the claim about a night that is better than 1,000 months, referring to Laylatul Qadr. What happens in places like the Bering Strait, for example? The Bering Strait experiences a day change where one side is still in the previous day and the other side is in the next day. What does that mean for fasting and prayers? Then, when it comes to Arafah fasting, some believe it must coincide with the day of Arafah in Saudi Arabia. But what happens when Arafah occurs during the day in Saudi Arabia and it's night in the opposite hemisphere? The fasting would need to take place at night, but it doesn't follow the same day, so we would end up following different dates. For example, in the Bering Strait, between Russia and the USA, what happens when one side is on a different day than the other? One side would follow one date, and the other side would follow a different one, even though they are on the same meridian. This is another example of how the teachings don't apply universally. In conclusion, two things have fallen apart: the health claims and the claim that these teachings are universal. The last thing, the final step in the process that I went through, this last process was difficult, but eventually, because I was still in an environment where I had been active in religious activities, especially at my home or near my house, many of my neighbors probably knew, as they were also my friends on Facebook. They understood, but I don't know what was in their hearts. The point is, this was the final step in my journey, and at that point, I truly let go, especially with regard to fasting. As for the North Pole, if you know, unless you believe the Earth is flat, but if you know the Earth is round, at the North Pole, there are certain days when the sun doesn't set. The sun keeps shining for several days or months. T here is a period of time where the sun doesn't set at all. Let me check that information again for you. The longest days during summer happen around the 21st of June to the 22nd of December, meaning that during that time, the North Pole experiences continuous daylight. T here is a transition period before it sets, and as the Earth rotates, there is a certain point in time when the sun will stay above the horizon for an extended period. Now, checking further. The North Pole experiences the sun rising on the 22nd of March and setting on the 21st of September every year, while the South Pole experiences sunrise on the 21st of September and sunset on the 22nd of March. So, if you are in the North or South Pole and you want to fast, that means fasting without food for 6 months straight. This is because the sun doesn't set for an extended period of time, making fasting for such a long duration practically impossible.
Okay, how about your family, sir? Are they still Muslim, or have they also left Islam?
My family, as I mentioned earlier, is relatively pluralistic. My family is quite small, and I am an only child, so I don't face any issues like persecution. I am grateful for that, even though, how should I say this, I myself am quite influential because of my profession and the influence of my parents, which is relatively strong. So when people want to question my beliefs, they usually won't want to interfere too deeply. I am grateful for that as well. We can still see that there are others in situations similar to mine who face unpleasant treatment. But if I were to suddenly and directly express my views, I am sure there would still be some kind of backlash. So for now, I just speak about it and even dare to show my face, especially when some of my students or friends happen to be listening or watching. They'll be surprised because they used to know me as someone who was very devoted to performing the obligatory prayers, and I didn't leave those duties behind. So they'll at least question me about it. But I've accepted it now. This is my decision, and I want them to know, for when the time comes, that when I pass away, they'll know what to do with me. So it's important for me to be open about this now, so there will be no doubts later. I have to be brave enough to show that I no longer hold the beliefs I once did. And honestly, the fear is still there. Despite my environment being relatively pluralistic and able to accept differences, there is still uncertainty, still fear. But in the end, I have to get it out so that people don't think I still hold on to those old beliefs when, in fact, I don't. I've started sharing articles related to what I believe now on Facebook, and some people have started asking questions, sending me DMs like, "Why did you change? What happened to you?" I explain as best as I can.
This is live now, so this is the first time notification for the public that you are logged out, right?
Yes, it could be like that.
Okay, among those who already know, who has known, and what's the worst reaction you've received so far?
There hasn't been any extreme reaction. It's mostly just that some people have started gossiping. They've started to realize, for example, at the office during Friday prayers. Friday prayers are usually crowded, right? Everyone goes together, but for one semester, I've stopped attending Friday prayers. Some people even caught me in the office during prayer time.
So how did that go?
Well, I just said, I wasn't praying. I might have been working on reports or assignments, or sometimes I just fell asleep. One of my colleagues said, "It's okay, if you are asleep, no problem." That's it, nothing more extreme than that. There were no long-term consequences, like being shunned or anything.
What about among your fellow lecturers? Do they know?
Well, if they know directly that I've logged out, I don't know. Unless they watch this live stream, then they'll find out. After we go live, I guess that's when it'll be known.
Do you think they will watch this live stream?
I am not sure if they're watching my account or following me. From what I've observed, when someone is willing to listen to or follow a perspective that's outside of their belief system, it's a sign they might eventually break free as well. But as long as they still firmly believe in what they believe, they're unlikely to seek out content like Tenparagi or topics like Sunnah Nabi, the Prophet's teachings, or other topics related to Islam.
So, T here is only a small chance they're watching this?
Yes, about 10%, I would say.
Okay, sir, but maybe some of your friends are watching, and maybe there are also other Muslim friends watching. Maybe T here is a message you'd like to convey to them. Please, go ahead.
Yes. Well, the point is that even though they are now on a different path so far, they haven't acted in the same extreme way that others with similar beliefs do. I am trying to use polite language here, friends who are more extreme in their beliefs. It hasn't been like that with them, but the point is, I won't try to persuade them to leave their beliefs. If they see this video, I am not trying to convince them to follow my way. Just like how I can still accept them, I hope we can still accept each other. I am saying that I no longer believe what they believe, and I don't share the beliefs we once held together. But let's just keep things the way they were before. Let's consider this just part of the natural process of life. I'll be happy if any of them feel enlightened, but I won't force anyone to follow the path I am on now, because what I am doing is the result of my own contemplation. It's not because of outside influences, but because I've learned something and followed a path that led me to this decision. So, for friends who are still in their old beliefs, the beliefs I once held, it's fine. I am not going to preach to them. In my previous belief, there was an obligation to share at least one verse, right? But from what I am experiencing now, you can be sure that I won't do that, because this is the result of my own contemplation, a very complex process. My hope is for everyone, whether they are still in their previous beliefs or in any belief, to live this life in peace. Let's make this our heaven here on earth. Let's do good and make everyone happy, so they feel comfortable in their own environment, in the community we all share. We don't have to wait for later. Let's create our own heaven right now. Maybe that's the message.
Yes, thank you, bro. So, you mean, earlier you mentioned that in heaven, in Jannah, there are rivers, fruits, and so on. In Indonesia, we already have those, right? Indonesia already has them, except in places like Arabia where they don't. In Indonesia, we have everything. It's true that Jannah, heaven, is in Indonesia, while it still exists.
Actually, T here is one more thing. This is also a trigger for me to talk more. It's okay if it gets a little long, right? So, for example, in the scriptures, I've come across a passage where all the names of fruits and places mentioned in the Holy Book, which supposedly comes from the Word of God, are only found in a small part of the entire world. For example, the names of fruits mentioned are only dates and figs. Why aren't there papayas or oranges or salak? The joke goes like that. And the names of the cities mentioned are just Mecca, Medina, and cities around there. Why aren't there Batavia, or Moscow, or London, which have existed for so long, or Rome, which is historical. That's one thing. It's related to what I said earlier about rivers flowing underneath. In my village, Tihir is a nice river that flows under my house. And the fruits in my grandfather's village, are they limited to just dates, figs, and olives? It seems very limited. It's said to be for all time, for all places, but in reality, it's very limited.
Yes, that's true. Sometimes, I also question, does Allah really speak the way we understand? Like in Sundanese, they can say F, but not P. Can Allah say P or G? It's not even in the Arabic alphabet, right?
Yes, that's true.
Okay, maybe one more thing, sir. So, why should you log out? Earlier, you mentioned that we shouldn't have differences with our friends, and some of your friends might say, okay, if that's the case, why not just stay together? Let's do this in solidarity. Let's just continue with the prayers. Follow along. It's okay. Don't worry. Don't be troubled. You don't have to believe it fully, but just follow along for the sake of unity.
Why should I continue with what I experienced before? That's what I experienced before, but now I've let it go. I'll still go through it. But when we believe in something, when we hold something true or practice something, we must do it fully. I can't practice a belief just out of solidarity or for any reason, because that becomes part of the ritual, which is central to the belief. But then I don't believe in the other aspects of it. I am one of those who, although I am a man, strongly oppose patriarchy. But in the teachings, patriarchy is very strong, influenced by the patriarchal Arab culture. When I believe that I am still required to perform acts of worship like prayers, fasting, and giving charity, but then I don't practice other teachings, I would be practicing something half-heartedly. On the other hand, I no longer believe in the concept of God that was previously taught to me in my religion. When I no longer believe in the divinity as understood in my previous faith, it means all the rituals related to that religion should also be left behind. I don't believe in the divinity in the way my previous religion defined it, so automatically, all the rituals I perform should be directed towards that belief. When I am still performing those rituals, but I no longer accept the concept of God behind them, what's the point? It becomes meaningless. That's why I decided to leave those rituals behind. If someone asks me why I don't follow those practices anymore, I would say that I can't, because fundamentally, the issue lies in the concept of Tawhid, the oneness of God. I can no longer accept it. I can no longer practice it. Therefore, I also have to be honest and admit that I cannot perform rituals related to that concept anymore.
So, in short, you feel that if you are still doing the rituals just because of solidarity or togetherness, you would feel like a hypocrite, right?
Yes, that's the simple way to put it.
Okay, I understand. But actually, you've done that for a few years, right? You still practice those rituals even though you didn't really believe in them?
Yes, that's correct. As I said earlier, I just recently decided to leave the prayer rituals, and that decision was made less than a year ago. I also decided not to fast with the intention of Ramadan this year.
So, how many years before this did you practice those rituals just for solidarity or togetherness? How many years was that?
Once again, it's a process. I can't really pinpoint exactly when it started. All I can understand is that I reached a point where I said, I am no longer going to pray, and that was less than a year ago. It wasn't just a single point. There were many points leading up to it, a continuous process, until I finally stopped praying and fasting.
Okay, anything else you'd like to say as a closing? Feel free to share.
I guess T here is nothing specific to add, but I just hope that the choice I made in my life, the belief I hold now, brings good to everyone. And I also hope the same for others. On one hand, I am grateful that my environment is not toxic, like what some people say nowadays. But I also hope that for those who are in environments that aren't supportive, they will find the courage to leave, at least from within themselves. T here is no need to force yourself to speak out, but we all know the reality. For those who choose to leave, the reception is often very harsh. The point is, if you no longer believe, don't force it. As I said earlier, if you no longer believe, then don't be afraid. Just leave it behind. If we believe in figures like Buya Sakhr or Gus Dur, we believe in them because they are influential figures, like holding a hot coal. You can't hold it. But if you are an ordinary person, we won't have that kind of influence on others. That's why I dare to do this. So, if you feel like questioning or critiquing something, then there must be something wrong with it. So, As I said earlier, I don't want to be a hypocrite, and that's my straightforward way of saying it. Thank you. And for those who are ready to log out and share their testimony like I did, feel free to fill out the apostate testimony form. Just open your browser, type the link, and you'll find the form there. Thank you.
Thank you, and may God bless you.
You are welcome. God bless you too.